Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski, the Executive Director of ASMIA, and it is once again my pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar series programs. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend Gershon Lewental. Gershon is a longtime friend and colleague, and by training is a cultural Middle East historian. He's currently now a lecturer at the Department of Middle East Studies at Ben-Gurion University. Before that, he also served at University of Oklahoma, Hebrew University, and since 2015, he has been the associate editor of the Journal of Parisianite Studies. Um, he really is a true medievalist. He knows a lot about the topic of Islam culturally and politically. And this afternoon, he's going to talk about the history of foreign intervention in Iran. And obviously, quite timely, much to talk about vis-a-vis the current war with Iran and the history of foreign policy and intervention with Iran at large. Housekeeping wise, Gershon will talk for about 30 minutes or so. We have to go a little bit over, or he has a lot to say. We'll do our best to get to everything. After Gershon is done with his remarks, we will go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you have to do is type in your questions in the chat, and we will do our best to respond in a timely fashion. If we do not get to your question this afternoon, please feel free to email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond as well. So really, without further ado, Gershon, welcome to the program, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, Asaf, and also to Emily and Suzanne and for Alex for inviting me and putting this together. And I'm sure there was some bureaucratic management, so thank you for all of that. I just shared my screen. Hopefully that works. I can maybe get a thumbs up from somebody just to let me know that you see it all.
You're good.
Okay, great. So first, before I begin, as you just said, Asaf, this is a very timely moment, given that we're still in the middle of this war, even though there's currently a ceasefire. And so I just want to start by expressing deep sympathy for all of the innocent victims of this terrible war. And my hope for the speedy recovery of anyone who is injured and the reconstruction of civilian, public, and historical sites across the region. I wish to tell a story about an ancient civilization that has, from its earliest formation, confronted a persistent structural condition rooted largely in its geography. And that is that as a land bridge linking Western Asia with the regions of Southern and Eastern Asia, Iran has long been exposed to recurrent foreign intervention. And this is the story of a cultural and political resilience, a striking and consistent capacity not merely to withstand external attacks and the rule of enemies, but to absorb, adapt, and ultimately reconstitute authority and identity in their aftermath, often through processes of synthesis that produce new political and cultural forms, even as they preserve and rework older traditions. But given the constraints of what I thought would be maybe a 40-minute lecture, and then I understand as a 30-minute lecture, and I'm going to try to be as compressed and condensed as I can in presenting a series of events, any one of which could easily sustain extended treatment in its own right. And so I'm going to focus on sketching a broader historical pattern rather than addressing every nuance, and I'm certainly happy to get into that further in the discussion that follows. My aim is to highlight a recurring pattern in Iran's history, one in which foreign interventions repeatedly produce outcomes very different from those intended, in order to better understand how and why Iran responds to external pressure today. So it's essential to underscore that Iran is not a recent or artificial construct, but it is an enduring political and civilizational entity. This point bears emphasis in a regional context where most of the states were created only after European imperial powers drew the political map of the modern Middle East in the aftermath of the First World War. By contrast, the idea, and at many points the political reality of Iran, extends back over 2.5 millennia, at least to the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in 550 BCE. The Achaemenid Empire is really the first world empire ruling Western Asia, Asia Minor, and Central Asia. And then in the 330s BCE, it is conquered by Alexander. Alexander, in turn, is absorbed into Iranian cultural memory as Iskandar in the Persian tradition. And he enters into the national epic, the Shahnameh, the national epic of Iran, as well as a separate Iskandar-Nameh tradition. So this is just the beginning of a pattern of foreigners who are acculturated into Iran, even in historical memory. The Parthian Empire and later on the Sasanian Empire, both of which ruled for almost a millennium of political continuity in more or less the same area, both of them confronting Roman empires of one name or another, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, eventually fell in the 7th century during the Arab-Islamic conquest. And this conquest led to the total destruction of Sasanian political order and the extinction of Iran as a political entity. But it's not the end of the story, because Iranians were integrated into Islamic civilization. There was a significantly prominent role played by Iranian intellectuals in various fields, from Islamic theology to history, mathematics, science, administration, even Arabic linguistics. And we see strong continuation of Sasanian bureaucratic models. So Iran may have ceased to exist as a state, but it didn't cease to exist as a civilization. And in what is called the Iranian intermezzo, a term coined by a Russian scholar in the 20th century, from about the 10th century to the middle of the 11th century, preceded in turn even by autonomous Iranian dynasties that emerged in the Islamic East, we see new phenomena, in particular, the emergence of the new Persian language, a synthesis of Middle Persian that is written in the Arabic script. And I want to highlight here a unique linguistic resilience. The only country overrun in the first stages of the Arab-Islamic conquest to retain its language was Iran. Now, Turkic invasions, part of a larger pattern of Turkic migrations, put an end to those independent Persian or Iranian sultanates that existed, but established new empires that ruled not only Iran, but nearly all of the Central Islamic world, actually not just in this period that we're talking about, let's say the 11th century, but even down to the 20th century. Almost every dynasty was of Turkic origin. And we see from that point on, for another 1,000 years, the military dominance of Turkic elites, a reliance on Persian, but I want to emphasize that even though they are military dominant, they rely on Persian administrative and cultural frameworks. We begin to hear about the men of the sword, so to speak, the Turks, versus the men of the pen, who are the Persians, the administrators. And this cultural sphere encapsulates all of these Turkic sultanates and later on the Turkic dynasties that rule. The vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, for example, wrote A Mirror for Princes, encapsulating ancient Iranian political theory in an Islamic form for Turkic rulers. And this Turkic-Iranian synthesis is what defines all of these states that emerge in the next 1,000 years, where Turkic tribes adopted Islam through an Iranian prism. And the result is the emergence of Persianate culture. In a cultural sphere that extends from the Ottoman Balkans to South Asia, the Persian language served as a lingua franca of administration, literature, and culture. And we see a shared literary canon, poetry and prose, and the use of Iranian models of kingship, bureaucracy, and court culture. The result is a synthesis, an Islamicate framework expressed through Persian language and Iranian cultural forms, even in the absence of an Iranian state. Now, all of this comes to a close, not all of what I've just described, the Persianate, but the Turkic period, comes to a close with the Mongol conquest in the 13th century, and the establishment of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, basically all of Asia, with the exception perhaps of India. But this massive state eventually disintegrates, and for our purposes, we're interested in the Ilkhanate that rules what is more or less Iran. Now, the Mongol conquest resulted in massive destruction, especially Central Asia, which had until that point been the heartland of Iranian culture. But we see that the Mongols rapidly assimilated and converted to Islam, and adopted Persian administration and culture. So there's a paradox regarding the Mongol period. It's that this destruction paved the way for modern Iran. Iran, for the first time, became a separate political entity under the Ilkhans, for the first time since the Sasanians, with direct diplomatic relations with the Christian West. We see a total and permanent displacement of Arabic by Persian, the widening of Iranian horizons as part of a vast borderless Asian empire from China to Europe. Even if there were fragmented khanates, they all interacted with one another. And those living in the Ilkhanate were exposed to influences, cultural, intellectual, military, and economic, from China to Europe. So, in fact, I always show my students this map, and then I superimpose here are the borders of modern Iran. In fact, we can see that the Ilkhanate is really the starting point for the emergence of modern Iran. But the founders of modern Iran are really the Safavids. And the Safavid Empire, which was established in 1501, one of what we call the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, all, by the way, as I said before, Turkic dynasties ruling over large populations and sharing a very common Persianate culture, in which Persian played a very significant role. But our emphasis, of course, right here is Iran. The Safavids made several major contributions to the establishment of modern Iranian identity, but the most important one, of course, is that they converted Iran to Shiism, and that is still the religion of the vast majority of Iran's population. And it was also the longest ruling dynasty since the pre-Islamic Sasanians. Now, the Safavids didn't call their empire the Safavid Empire. They used the term Mamlaka Mahruse Iran, the guarded domains of Iran. And this term, I think, emphasizes very clearly the territorial integrity of the country. We can see that already being a very critical point, even at this period. And the Safavids indeed had to deal with the problem of guarding their domains throughout their 220 odd years of existence. Repeated foreign incursions from the Ottomans in the west, the Uzbeks in the northeast, the Portuguese in the south, Mughals occasionally in the east, and at the very end, we start to see the emergence even of the Russians. This is a problem that the Safavids repeatedly had to deal with, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. Now, the Safavid Empire collapsed in 1722 when Afghan tribesmen succeeded in toppling the dynasty, leading to a century of chaos and civil war. But I want to focus on one early point of the 18th century, in which this total collapse that saw, as you can see on this map, invasions from all of the neighboring countries, Russia, the Ottomans, the Uzbeks, and Afghans, not to mention even the Mughals. The response was reconsolidation. The rise of Nader Shah Afshar, military general, who led this reconsolidation, not only expelling all of the foreign powers, but expanding Iran's borders. And this is a pattern that I want to emphasize time and time again of foreign conquest leading to indigenous reassertion. Now, Nader Shah's increasing madness and tyranny led to his own assassination, and thereafter his empire disintegrated owing to internal strife. And I think this too is an important lesson for the present, that the chaos that can affect Iran that becomes the worst is often self-inflicted. It's often when within Iran there is fighting and chaos. But the 18th century and the turmoil of this period led to two significant shifts that I want to emphasize. First, the transfer of the locus of authority from the dynasty that ruled Iran at whatever point we're talking about to the Iranian people, even if this is only done symbolically. And, you know, the example, there are several examples, but if I've chosen to show an image of the coronation of Nader Shah, one example is his coronation at the plain of Mohan, where he assembled individuals and representatives of all populations of Iran, all religious groups, all social classes. Now, of course, he was a dictator, he was a military ruler, he wasn't about to let anyone decide whether he really becomes a Shah or not, a king or not. But he wanted this representation there. He wanted to make the emphatic point that he is being coronated by the entire population of Iran. The second major shift of the 18th century is the triumph of an usuli form of Shiism, a principalist form, which is marked on the one hand by flexibility and innovation, and on the other hand by the social and religious power of religious clerics. And that, of course, is critical to understanding developments in subsequent Iranian history to the present. Now, the Qajars succeeded in cobbling together a coalition of different segments of Iranian society at the end of the 18th century in order to put an end to this political instability. But they had to deal with external threats throughout their reign, especially in this period. We're talking about threats from Russia in the north and Britain in the east. And this encroachment gradually bit away at the margins of Iran, as you can see from this map. In addition, it's not just military encroachments that they had to deal with, but economic ones. The capitulations, which were unfair extraterritorial agreements that were imposed on the Qajars, no less than they were imposed on the Mughals and the Ottomans as well, allowed foreigners to get away with all sorts of exemptions on taxation, but even on crimes, and economic concessions that Iran was pressured into offering for financial incentives. And this culminated at the end of the 19th century, in 1891-92, with what is known as the tobacco protest, in response to a concession for the sale, consumption, growing, anything you could think of to do with tobacco. And since this was seen as such a blatant, corrupt act, the leading Shi'i clerical authority announced in a fatwa that tobacco was forbidden and nobody could touch it, consume it, use it, sell it, buy it, what you name it. And overnight, people stopped and the concession became completely worthless, so much so that the Shah had to cancel it. Now, this episode is significant because it demonstrated for the first time these growing networks of interconnectivity between different social forces in Iran, the clerics, intellectuals, merchants, all of whom had felt threatened by the growing and rising power of Western European powers. But it also demonstrated that the Shah, that the king, the emperor, was not all-powerful. And this ends up culminating in 1905 in the Constitutional Revolution, a real constitutional revolution, the first one in the Middle East, one of the first outside of Europe, taking inspiration, of course, from the Japanese Constitution and the Japanese victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. This was an attempt to establish constitutional monarchy in Iran and parliamentary rule. And it brought together a broad coalition of wide segments in Iran, especially these groups that I just mentioned, intellectuals, merchants, and clerics. Unfortunately, this constitutional revolution, which had such promise and could have really ushered in a completely different, not just Iran, but Middle East as a whole, was undermined by Russian and British interventions. The Russian-backed Cossack Brigade helped the counter-revolution, even shelling the Majlis, the parliament, at the start of 1907. And in August of 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention decided to divide Iran, ending the Great Game, this competition between the two powers in Central Asia. And for the constitutionalists, this was an utter betrayal. Britain, whose ideas had inspired the revolutionaries and the idea of constitutionalism, saw that Britain was really just interested in its own economic and political interests and not in constitutionalism or, dare I even say, democracy. Ultimately, Russian troops put an end to the constitutional period in December 1911 when they expelled the deputies from the Majlis. And Iran, for the next decade or so, just became the battlefield of Ottoman, British, and Russian empires in the First World War, despite being officially neutral. And during this period, millions of Iranians died, especially due to famine. So what's the result of this disintegration that was forced upon them by foreign powers? Is the rise to power of Reza Khan, later Reza Shah Pahlavi, who comes to power as part of an effort to reestablish centralized control and order in Iran. Great powers had sought a pliant Iran, and they received instead, under Reza Shah, an ascendant Iran set on a course of modernization, nationalization, and secularization under fierce autocratic rule. And therefore, despite European opposition, Reza Shah pursued major infrastructural, industrial, and educational modernization projects like the Trans-Iranian Railway. Now, Reza Shah tried to use Germany, especially in the 1930s, as a counterweight to Britain, which controlled the Middle East. But this backfired after June 1941, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. And what happened 2 months later? Britain and the Soviet Union invaded neutral Iran in August, using Iran as a Persian corridor for US and British military assistance to the Soviet Union, using, by the way, the very rail network that Reza Shah had built despite British objections. Reza Shah himself is forced to abdicate, and he is replaced with his young and inexperienced son, Mohammad Reza Shah, who will reign more or less from 1941 until 1979. The Allied occupation of Iran during the war until 1946 caused widespread devastation, inflation, and starvation. The overwhelming majority of Iranian agricultural produce went to the Soviet Union, and therefore Iranians starved to death. Now, after the Second World War, in the early 1950s, oil becomes a major political issue. I haven't mentioned oil until this point, but it was discovered in Iran in 1908 by the British entrepreneur William Knox D'Arcy. And in 1909, the following year, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is founded. It will go through several names. It is known today as British Petroleum BP. The transition of the British Navy from coal to oil in 1914, or just before 1914, led the British to take over the Iranian oil industry. This was Churchill's decision. And although Reza Shah succeeded in increasing Iranian revenue terms, the overall control continued to remain with the British. Now, Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist parliamentarian noted for his opposition to the Pahlavi dynasty, used the oil issue as a path to power, becoming appointed prime minister in 1951. He oversaw the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. And this prompted the United States and Britain to overthrow him in a coup that is a matter of fact. The CIA has released its records. We all know that the United States and Britain were involved in this. Now, even though the coup was successful in restoring the Shah to power, the Shah fled from Iran, went to Rome, and then thereafter he came back. Nevertheless, a subsequent oil agreement restored some foreign control, but it was really impossible to undo what had been done. And by 1974, the National Iranian Oil Company, NIOC, had full control of the oil industry. Now, this episode is so important, as well as the constitutional revolution for that matter. And it's very hard to underemphasize the importance of the toppling of Mossadegh in the Iranian psyche. Every Iranian schoolchild learns these histories, and they learn about how Western powers colluded in order to stymie Iranian will, Iranian constitutionalism, Iranian self-autonomy. And so the lesson that is learned is that the West is not our friend, and they don't have our interests at heart. But there's also another lesson, and that is that foreign intervention produces unintended political consequences. The tobacco concession led to the constitutional revolution. The British and Russian intervention before and after the First World War led to a strong centralized Pahlavi autocracy. And the toppling of Mossadegh leads about 20 years later to the Islamic Revolution, all the while by delegitimizing moderate and pro-Western forces in Iran. Now, the Islamic Revolution also saw a broad coalition of social forces, intellectuals, religious clerics, merchants, just like before, responding to increasing repression of the Pahlavi autocracy, as well as to Western cultural imperialism. But what's important for me to emphasize is that this was a real revolution. It was not a revolution in name, like we often hear this term bandied about, the Egyptian Revolution or whatever, the Velvet Revolution. This was a real revolution like the French Revolution and like the Russian Revolution that completely saw an overturning of society. I mean, that's the term, revolution, that it's rotating. And it does not lack real social roots, but it grew out of a genuine popular revolution. Now, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who was seen as the figurehead of this movement, was, perhaps seen by many as a useful figure by some of the elements that were part of the revolutionary movement. But this coalition quickly disintegrated into competing factions, and he proved to be the most capable out of them in consolidating power. But he also had, we could say, divine intervention, and that came in the form of the Iran-Iraq War. Saddam Hussein thought that he could use this as the opportunity to invade Iran, to seize territory, expand his control, his access to waterways. But instead, he ended up providing the regime, the new regime, with an external enemy and a unifying cause. And the rally around the flag effect, which is common in all societies, took effect after September of 1980. And the war, the Iran-Iraq War, is known as the sacred defense, Difa Muqaddas in Persian. This war facilitated the consolidation of the Islamic Republic. And so it's possible, one could, I don't engage in counterfactual history, one could imagine that had Saddam not done this, it's not a guarantee that the Islamic Republic would have survived the early 1980s. But Iran fought tenaciously, and even after expelling Iraq, refused to sign a ceasefire, leading the war to drag on for 8 years. Another important lesson that we should pay attention to. It was, in fact, the longest conventional war of the 20th century, and Khomeini only reluctantly agreed to end the war in 1988, due primarily to severe economic strain, as well as fears of military collapse. And he described signing the ceasefire as drinking from the poisoned chalice, Jam-e Zeher. So, with this survey having been concluded, what can we learn from all this? What are the historical patterns that we can discern, and what implications do they have for the present? So first of all, I want to make this very clear. I am not an apologist by any means for the Islamic Republic. I am Israeli. I am not able to visit Iran, or presumably if I visit, I'm not able to leave Iran. And I have no interest in defending the Islamic Republic. It is a profoundly corrupt regime. It lacks internal ideological legitimacy according to even its own background and its own ideology. It is a supporter and sponsor of terrorism. And most importantly, especially for me, first and foremost, it fiercely represses its own people. And we don't need to look very far back in history. We just think back a couple of months ago to the wholesale slaughter of innocent protesters at the start of this year. So I want to make this clear. On the other hand, I'm looking at this situation as an historian, trying to understand Iran using the eyes of what we can learn from history. And we see several things. First of all, we see increasing dissatisfaction with the regime. The Iranian public expresses deep social malaise and hopelessness. There are various demographic pressures, drug addiction, de facto secularization of society, economic mismanagement and crisis, environmental challenges and water crisis. I mean, just the taps just barely didn't run dry in Tehran this past fall. And the protests have increasingly intensified. There was the reformist phase of protests from 99 to maybe 2009, where people thought they could still maneuver within the regime structure. And then in the subsequent decade, maybe we could call the decentralized economic and social protests. But beginning with 2022, with the Women Life Freedom protests, Zan Zendegi Azadi, we see unique changes. The largest mass mobilization since 1979, a youth-led, a women-led, and a decentralized movement that was also cross-class and cross-ethnic. So what's the political meaning from that? That they challenged misogyny and autocracy. The movement went beyond reform to explicit calls for regime change. And this continued even further in the protests that broke out in December, that were sparked by economic collapse and the after effects, perhaps, of the 12-day war with Israel in June. And the regime there demonstrated that it failed to provide even the bare modicum of what it owed its population, especially after those harsh years of the Iran-Iraq war and the sacrifices that Iranians made, the economic sacrifices that they make. It couldn't promise them security, revealing its own weakness. And this wave of protests, as we all know, led to the harshest regime crackdown yet, a total internet blackout, and estimated deaths ranging anywhere from 3,000 to 20,000 or even more in the span of just 2 days. Now, what I think is interesting is just before this war began at the very end of February, I noticed that protests had begun on a small scale again in Iran. And I thought it was possible that they would intensify yet again. But the war broke out, and that ended up putting a halt to that. So what do we see here is that the protests have been cumulative, not episodic. There's a transition from reform to rejection of the regime. And the regime endures without popular consent. The recent crackdown signals that it has totally abandoned even the facade of seeking public support. But instead of allowing history to take its course, the United States and Israel, like Saddam, provided the Islamic Republic with the greatest gift. They totally undermined the opposition, and they placed Iranian people into an existential crisis of survival. Now, it's inevitable that they are going to oppose foreign aggressors, because not only does this lead to damage to personal safety, but even to destruction of civilian and heritage sites. Trump's genocidal threat to extinguish Iranian civilization, which is fairly ironic given the pretext of the war to prevent access to nuclear weapons, should not also be discounted. And opposition to the regime in Iran does not equal support for foreign intervention. And even amongst those who, let's say, do support foreign intervention, they have been totally delegitimized by this war. Every society experiences rally around the flag effects after being attacked. And you can compare this to the protest movement in Israel that totally disappeared after the 7th of October. I know it still exists, but it's completely ineffective ever since. And you can think about other cases around the world. And when we think about delegitimization of protests, just think about these foolish remarks by Trump about arming protesters by sending weapons through the Kurds, and what this means for future protests that have already been demonized by the regime as having been funded and supported by Western powers. So even if this war resumes and the IRA is toppled, the new regime will be completely bereft of legitimacy. Take a look at this image, by the way, while I continue. Just think about the individual that you see and the poster that she's holding, and whether there is some sort of cognitive dissonance going on here. And that's the result of these kind of wars. Now let's look at the regime perspective before I come to a close. From the regime's point of view, there's a total lack of trust. There were efforts made towards what was called a grand bargain in 2001 to 2003 under the reformist government that failed and ended up seeing Iran inducted into the axis of evil in 2002. In 2015, Iran signed the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, to which it remained committed until Trump canceled the agreement in 2018. Serious negotiations with Iran, with the United States in spring of 2025 were torpedoed last year by Israeli attacks on Iran in June. And again, in the midst of US-Iran negotiations just a month ago, or a month and a half ago, the United States and Israel attacked Iran. So if you are someone in the regime in Iran, what is the lesson that you've learned? Is that you have incredible incentive now to pursue deterrence in the North Korean model, because nobody dares to touch North Korea. Ultimately, the regime has been strengthened. Internal opposition has been totally delegitimized. Wars, in fact, often strengthen authoritarian systems and even democratic ones. An old and sick Ali Khamenei was replaced with younger Mojtaba Khamenei, the only person with the power to restrain the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, was replaced by a puppet of the Revolutionary Guards. Iran now has control over Hormuz, which it didn't have before the war. There's been a rise, in fact, of Iranian oil revenues. Iran's regional rivals have been damaged, and even the United States, and I would say let's look at the very poor performance, I think, of the American Air Force, and improved PR. Iran went from being a regime that massacred its population a couple of months ago to being a beleaguered nation leading the resistance against the United States and Israel. And finally, we have to also think of the broader global geopolitical fallout of the further decline of US hegemonic power. So some last concluding remarks. As an historian, with no ability to look at the future, I don't pretend ever to be a voodoo scientist, which I think are called at universities political scientists. I'm an historian. I like to deal with what happened and what we know. But what can we learn about the present from what we have learned in the past? First, there is an authentic sense of Iranian identity and pride in its ancient history and culture that has produced a strong nationalist urge amongst most Iranians. And that is ultimately expressed even further in a rally around the flag effect during wartime. And so a war can actually radicalize Iranian politics rather than weaken the regime. The Iranian political psyche has long been enmeshed in conspiracy theories about external powers trying to undermine Iranian sovereignty. This was expressed most creatively in Iraj Pezeshkzad's 1973 novel, Die John Napoleon, Dear Uncle Napoleon, excellent translation by Dick Davis, I recommend it to everyone, in which the titular character sees British spies everywhere. And this is rooted in real historical experience. And this has been recharged and reinvigorated now due to the US-Israel war on Iran. It's also led to the political delegitimation of opposition to the regime, at least in the immediate term. And I would say rather cautiously that an end to the external threat could possibly see a return of protests since the underlying socioeconomic crises still remain. And now, history offers clear precedents. The Iran-Iraq War did not break the Islamic Republic, it ended up consolidating it. And the same pattern appeared much earlier at the founding point of modern Iran in 1514 at the Battle of Chaldiran. The rising Safavid state suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Ottomans. Its army was shattered and demoralized. Its capital was abandoned and occupied. Yet the Safavids did not collapse. They withdrew, they regrouped, and they endured. And even after renewed Ottoman incursions decades later, they not only recovered their territories, but they went on to expand to the height of their power. The lesson for me as a historian is stark. In Iran, external assault has rarely achieved its intended aims. It has instead hardened resolve, reconfigured power, and time again produced a stronger state in its wake. Thank you.
Gershon, thank you for that comprehensive historical overview, which is obviously critical all around for us to understand. There is a lot to discuss and a lot to dive into. So let me, Alex, you want to take the first question before we go to the audience, and then we'll go for more.
Well, thanks very much for an obviously very sweeping overview. I was struck, however, by one word that you did not mention, and that was Zoroaster. And the fact really is, Persians constitute only 61% of the Iranian population. Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda, predate Islam by, depending on how you count, between 1,000 and 1,500 years. And that's really the authentic Iranian religious tradition. Everything else is an overlay. Everything else is imported in one way or another. Shiism above all. But if you go back to even, I don't know, the Mesopotamian influence periods, none of the externalities are original. They're all innovations like writing, like imagery that are imported and adapted and then succeed or fail. So I wonder, what is the role of indigenous Iranian religion and tradition in contemporary Iran, where nobody goes to mosque anymore, where the birth rate is only 1.4%. Iranians choose not to reproduce and have chosen, or the women have chosen, which is good for them, I guess, that they want to end the Iranian civilization effectively.
So you've mentioned several things. I'll try to I'll try to touch on
equally
all of them
sweeping to your presentation. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. And I covered myself also as briefly as I could. I tried my best. I don't think there's any society or civilization that is static, and nobody stays the same. No people, no nation. There's always change. Even if we think about Judaism, right? The ancient Jews, the religious practices that they observed were not identical to the religious practices of Judaism today. Rabbinical Judaism comes long after the patriarchs and the classical period and the kingdoms and so forth. And then even that changes, right? The point that I'm trying to make is that, let's say, Zoroastrianism was a significant religious factor in pre-Islamic Iran. It wasn't the only one. The heartlands of the Sasanian Empire, where most of its population lived, was Iraq today. And the majority of the population there, scholars debate, was either Christian or Jewish. But we could say that it was definitely not Zoroastrian. It was one of these two religious populations. And so for that reason, Zoroastrians may have been a significant factor, and certainly amongst the ruling elite in the Sasanian Empire. But if we go further back, the Parthian Empire, there's an open question over whether there was a state religion and what that was. And certainly even we go even further back than that. So, Zoroastrianism was very closely identified with the empire that fell immediately before Islam. And for those who, were Iranian and continued to adhere to it in the aftermath. But the process of adoption of Islam was very organic. It took about 300 years for Iran to become a Muslim country. And not coincidentally, that's exactly when once it becomes a largely Muslim country, is precisely when we start to see autonomous Iranian dynasties that emerge. And these are the ones that are able to fuse their Iranian identity, their heritage, and their culture, along with their new Islamic identity. And I think it's impossible to separate the two. We saw an effort in the 20th century. The Shah of Iran tried to focus on the Iranian ethnic, secular identity at the expense of the Islamic one, and the result was the Islamic Revolution. And I would argue that the Islamic Republic has tried to do the opposite, and it has failed. In fact, that's part of what I've done my own research on, is exactly the use of even nationalist rhetoric by the revolutionary authorities, because they realize that if they want to galvanize the population, they need to appeal to their sense of identity as Iranians, not just to their sense of identity as Shiis or as Muslims. So I think there is a symbiosis that exists between these two concepts in modern Iranian identity. Now, having said that, the greatest threat to Islam in Iran has been the Islamic Republic. I don't want to, this is a topic of its own. Maybe I'll do a separate webinar one day on that. But the Islamic Republic was never supported by the majority of Shi'i clerics in the world for many reasons. But one of those reasons is that it completely undermines the organic nature of the Shiite hierarchy, this kind of pyramid of authority that exists within the Shi'i world. And by establishing kind of a state, then you're basically undermining anything that was natural and authentic about it. And the result has been that there are not many senior, very important clerics of Shiism in Iran. Most of them are outside. Most of them want nothing to do with the Islamic Republic. And the Islamic Republic itself has a crisis of legitimacy. There are on many factors. You look at Ali Khamenei, the leader who was killed, the supreme leader. He was a middling cleric. He had no significant level of expertise when he was appointed the supreme leader, supposedly, of the Shi'i world in 1989. And there was even Khomeini had not been really the greatest, erudite scholar, but he had much more justification for claiming that. Khomeini had none of it, and certainly his son has none of it whatsoever. So the regime was no longer a religious regime. And many of the internal critics of the Islamic Republic, and I think one example is the philosopher Shabastari, who points out that basically Iran has become de facto a secular state. The fact that the regime has to mandate wearing the hijab or mandate religious practices means that people don't want to do it. And if people don't want to do it from their own free will, then they're actually not interested in it. So to kind of go back to your very last, last part of your question, certainly, I think Iranian society has become perhaps one of the most secular. And in the same way that the Islamic Revolution was the avant-garde in the return of Islam to the political field, the Islamism that we saw taking over and playing a prominent role in many parts of the Middle East, maybe Iran will then herald the next step later on of something else, but moving away from Islamist politics.
Moving away from Islamic identity, potentially.
There are certainly those who believe so. I don't know. I'll leave my judgment, I'll withhold my judgment, but I have heard many people make the argument that they think that if, the regime falls in an organic fashion, that Iranians will want nothing to do with Islam. I suspect that there will always be some, the regime still enjoys 20 to 25% support of the population. There's always going to be those that are traditional, but I don't disagree with you that the position of Islam will be greatly degraded after the Islamic Republic falls. And that's partly, I mean, in great part, due to the crimes of the Islamic Republic that has delegitimated Islam for much of the population, has pushed them away from it.
Very good. Well, let's go to some
Yeah,
questions from the.
Yeah, we got a bunch of questions in the audience, so let's try to do that, and we'll come back if we need to.
Sure.
Suzanne, why don't you start us off with our friend Avi Shilon, and we'll go from
Yes, we have a question here from Avi Shilon, and he writes, well, first he says, thank you for your thoughtful talk. And given your misgivings about the current war due to Iranian history, what would you suggest to do in order to stop their nuclear and missile enterprises?
That's a tough question. First of all, I'm not paid enough to come up with answers to questions like this, but I will still try to suggest some ideas. First, I don't see any way that issue can be resolved in a military fashion. I think the United States and Israel had their opportunities to do that last year in June, and they failed. And I think that this war demonstrated that they failed even more. I don't think that was impossible. And so therefore, the only result is some sort of negotiation. Now, there are those that believe that the Islamic Republic is dead set on getting nuclear weapons because they have a desire to destroy the state of Israel and to commit, I guess, collective suicide. I don't think so. I think that they are profoundly corrupt individuals that lead the regime. They're interested in their own personal well-being and their family's well-being and their financial situation. And therefore, I think they have pragmatic, they're perfectly willing to be pragmatic as long as it comes to their own bottom line. And therefore, they could be persuaded to negotiate over elements of the nuclear program. And in fact, the nuclear program may itself be a bargaining chip that they have been building this whole time, along with their proxies, along with the missile program, and so on and so forth. Now, it's possible, and one could accuse me of being naive, but I also think we've tried this military approach, and I don't think that it's been successful. But the JCPOA was considered by not all, but by many observers to be the best of the worst options. And Iran did adhere to the stipulations of that agreement. Now, it's possible that an agreement like that could be renegotiated, that Iran could have that. And I would say, looking at the crises that face the Islamic Republic, I think that it has its own issues to deal with. And I would actually like it to have to face these problems because they have done terrible deeds to their own populations, and they should answer to their own population for that. And their own population should be the one to hold them accountable. And the way that we do that is by leaving them alone so that they don't have these excuses to say, we're being attacked, we're on the defense, but rather that the population could say, where is what comes to us, right? You can't have 100 million people, starving to death, suffering with no hope, no economic prospects. So my suggestion, humble suggestion would be that there would be some need for serious negotiations. Now, those negotiations would probably have to take into consideration many partners. And certainly after this war, there's a whole lot of reshuffling of the deck. But I think that that's probably the only realistic option for restraining the nuclear program. I'll just say one last point here, which is that Khamenei had issued a fatwa forbidding Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon because it was against Islam. And one could say again that this was cynical, but if you looked at it, they had the ability to come up with a nuclear weapon. They came very close, and they always stepped away from that line. They didn't cross the line. And therefore, I really do believe that they didn't intend to actually create one, but it's that this is a crisis they're trying to create in order to negotiate away the sanctions. Now, Khamenei's fatwa was, according to the rules of Usuli Shiism, in effect only during his lifetime. And now that he's dead, that fatwa is canceled. So by killing him, actually, they have also eliminated the only person who guarantees that fatwa. And unless his son, if he's alive or able to or whatever, issues a fatwa like that, that door is open. But I don't know if Iran would rush towards that, because it would launch nuclear war that would then end up being something disastrous for all of humanity, not just for Iran.
Thank you. Okay, the next question we have here is from Emmanuel Obua, and he writes, there are attempts to minimize the role of the CIA in the overthrow of Mossadegh. In fact, a previous webinar presenter concluded that it was not a coup, rather Mossadegh was fired by the Shah. Where do you stand? A coup and foreign intervention by the CIA, or firing of the prime minister by the Shah?
Well, as with so many, cases of historical controversies, it's all of the above. I mean, the problem is when it comes to Mossadegh, and he attracts so much attention even still today, precisely because it's become so ingrained into the Iranian psyche that it's become such a touchstone, a third rail, in terms of Iranian political history. But there's a couple of points. Mossadegh, he was not a democratically elected prime minister because he was appointed by parliament and the Shah. I mean, there was no democratic elections that were going on with the whole population voting. Women, by the way, weren't allowed to vote until the 1960s when the Shah pushed that through. So we can't call him a democratically elected leader, but he was a constitutionally appointed leader through the parliament. He opposed the Shah. He had opposed the Shah's father as well. The Shah had been forced to deal with him. He tried to fire him and failed, and that's what led to him fleeing in 1953. Now, one could say and make the argument that legally Mossadegh had been fired, and therefore he was not the legal head of state in Iran. And I would say that I don't think that that's even necessarily a problem when we think about the historical importance of this event, because for Iranians, even if he wasn't a legitimate leader, they were fed up with the rule of the Shah, and they were fed up with the oil situation. And he did have a great deal of public support. And therefore, and I'll also add something that for people on the very pro-Mossadegh side that they won't be happy about is that he had dictatorial tendencies. He was not a Democrat at heart. He envisioned himself as the ruler of Iran. So I think ultimately, the U.S. And British coup, which the CIA has admitted, there's no question about it, overthrew him. And it just becomes a matter of technicality. Was he the official or legal ruler of Iran or not? But I think it's irrelevant, because for practical purposes, the CIA intervened into Iranian politics and restored the Shah. Whether or not the Shah was the rightful or legal, or Mossadegh was, I think that's somewhat less relevant.
Great. Okay, the next question that we have here is I can't quite tell who submitted it, but the question is it realistic to think that the Iranian historic nationalist identity alone could replace this regime with bare hands without military or weapon resources? The examples show that people itself did not win against foreign intervention in Iran historically. At least this time, the intervention aligns with the people's demands. Thoughts?
Okay, I'm not 100% sure I understood the question in its entirety, but I think I did. And if not, then I hope the questioner will elucidate. I think it's very hard to know what the people wanted in Iran. I mean, the protests were very large. They certainly were the largest in recent memory in Iran. But I don't think that in a country of 100 million, they certainly didn't exceed a million people. And so in that sense, it's really hard to say what the population wanted. And now, having said that, I think it's clear that the vast majority, and there are surveys, in fact, carried out by the Gaman establishment, GAMAAN, which are considered to be fairly reliable. One that was conducted in September, that's of course before the protests, but it still does gauge levels of support and positions of the Iranian public. And there seems to be support for about 20 to 25% of the population for the regime. And, the remainder consists of those who are diehard opponents. They will do anything to topple it. And those who, like the silent majority in most countries, they would prefer that it would go, but they don't want to have violence. And they don't live too long, removed from the violence of the revolution of 1978-79, the purges that took place, it was just awfully bloody. I mean, we forget how difficult and complicated and horrible revolutions really are. And so people don't necessarily want to go through that same process all over again. The settling of accounts and murders and so forth that always take place in these kind of situations. So I think the silent majority probably hopes for some sort of organic transition. And I think that is possible. I think the regime would eventually be forced to kind of accommodate these kind of oppositions in some way, because they can't just rule through bayonets indefinitely. There is going to be some point in which they have to, accommodate, even if it's just a generational switch. Now, going back to what I think was asked by the question, I think in terms of what can be done, I think the international population, the international community has very little that it can do inside of Iran. It can certainly try to find ways, creative ways, maybe through all sorts of, I'm not the right person to talk about this, but all sorts of, ways to engage with the population in surreptitious means, to provide them with moral support and so forth in the struggle against the regime. Those kind of things could take place. I don't know. I mean, those are not, things that I normally deal with. But in terms of the population itself, it's to express support for them. It's to isolate the regime. It's to marginalize the regime for its actions in what they did in January. And we started to see that countries like Germany and France that had been hesitant to speak full-throatedly against the regime when it carried out acts of repression and atrocities had done so. I don't think they had done so previously. And I think that was a big step forward and encouragement of the Iranian people. I'm kind of hesitating because we're at such a strange moment right now. I have no idea what the situation is going to unfold once this war ends, given everything that has happened. I'm sure there will be major changes in Iran as a result. But that is my suggestion. It's horrible. I will share something personal, which is that, of course, as these protests were going on and the crackdown, I was heartbroken, like so many people who observe Iran, and certainly someone who's dedicated my whole life to studying Iran and loves this country and its people and its culture. And it just broke my heart. And my wife, who is from the Iranian world herself, kept saying, I wish that the world would intervene and help them and fight a war and everything. And here this happened. And I told her all the time, I said, I don't think that will help the situation. And it didn't. We didn't see an uprising because people were terrified to do anything. And now they've been delegitimized. So I think they've actually been pushed even further back. And so it's horrible because we feel we want to help. And there is not so much that certainly not we ordinary people could do. But I don't think that fighting a war and it's not going to be the result, because even, as I said, if they topple the regime, whatever comes about will always have been seen as having rode into power on the backs of American tanks and fighter planes. And that is not a recipe for a long-standing and stable government. That's a recipe for a dictatorial regime. And I don't think that's going to help the Iranian people any better.
Gershon, I know I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, so I really want to, and I know it's a little late for you, Israel time, so I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us, and I appreciate all of us appreciate the comprehensive survey of everything you've done today. There's a lot to unpack here, and you've spent your career studying Iran and Iranian culture, so we appreciate your time and giving us your take on all of this. Hopefully, come back. Things are obviously developing, on a daily basis. And there's much to talk about. So I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us. Above all, obviously, I want to thank my colleagues, as always, for joining me, Alex, Suzanne, and Emily. And for the audience, as always, for taking the time to hear and listen. Be on the lookout for future webinars. Gershon is one of our longtime members. It's kind of a sample of what you can hear at our upcoming conference in November. I urge you all to join us in November in Washington and be on the lookout for future webinars. So I want to wish everybody a good day and good evening to Gershon in Israel, and we will talk soon. Everybody have a good day.
Thank you.